Here's something most people never think about. Somewhere in America right now, a corporation is running a spreadsheet on human beings. Not metaphorically, literally. Cost per inmate, revenue per bed, occupancy rate, margin per contract. It reads exactly like a hotel chain's earnings report, except the guests can't leave, and the company gets paid more when the building stays full. Private prisons are a real, multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States. Two companies alone, CoreCivic and Geo Group, control the vast majority of it, and together, they manage well over 100,000 beds across the country. So today we're breaking down exactly how this business works. Not the politics of it, not the moral debate you've probably already heard 100 times. The numbers. How much it costs to build one, how the money actually flows in, where the profit margins hide, and why, financially speaking, an empty prison is the worst thing that can happen to a company like this. Let's start with what it actually costs to get into this business. Building a single medium security prison from the ground up typically runs somewhere between $100 million and $200 million, depending on capacity and location. A 1,500 bed facility, which is a fairly standard size for a private operator, tends to land right in that range once you account for land acquisition, site preparation, and the specialized construction requirements that come with the territory. And this isn't like building an apartment complex or a warehouse. Every wall, every door, every window has to meet security specifications that dramatically increase the cost per square foot. We're talking reinforced concrete, steel core doors, layered perimeter fencing, guard towers, and surveillance infrastructure that has to run continuously, every hour of every day, for decades. Then there's the land itself. Prisons need a lot of it, usually somewhere between 50 and 100 acres, once you include the buffer zones required by law between the facility and the nearest residential area. And that land is almost never expensive downtown real estate. Operators specifically hunt for cheap, rural parcels, partly for cost reasons, and partly because that's where local governments are most willing to say yes. A struggling rural county with high unemployment will often roll out the red carpet for a facility like this, because it promises jobs. We'll come back to that, because it turns out to be one of the most important parts of the whole model. On top of construction, you've got technology and security systems. Modern facilities run on centralized control rooms, biometric access systems, and camera networks covering literally every corridor. So add another $8 to $15 million just for that layer. Again, scaling with facility size. So before a single inmate walks through the door, you're already $120 to $220 million deep. And that's before you've paid a single staff member or turned on a single light. Now here's where it gets interesting, because staffing is actually the single largest ongoing expense in this entire business, dwarfing everything else by a wide margin. A private prison running at full capacity needs a correctional officer for roughly every 4 to 6 inmates, on top of medical staff, kitchen staff, maintenance crews, administrative personnel, and management. For a 1,500 bed facility, that adds up to something like 300 to 400 employees. Officer pay typically runs somewhere between $35,000 and $50,000 a year, which sounds modest until you multiply it across hundreds of positions, factor in shift differentials for round-the-clock coverage, and add benefits. All in, staffing alone can eat up 60 to 70% of a facility's entire operating budget. This is the number every private prison operator obsesses over, because it's also the number they have the most control over. And unfortunately, that control gets exercised in ways that show up in the headlines. Understaffing, high turnover, and reliance on mandatory overtime are chronic issues in this industry, precisely because labor is the expense operators are most incentivized to squeeze. Beyond staffing, you've got food service, which sounds simple until you realize you're feeding a population of 1,000+ people 3 meals a day, every day, forever, at a legally mandated minimum caloric and nutritional standard. Medical care is another massive line item, because operators are constitutionally required to provide adequate health care, and inmate populations tend to have higher rates of chronic illness, mental health needs, and substance abuse issues than the general population. Utilities for a facility that never turns off its lights or its locks. Maintenance on security systems that cannot be allowed to fail. Insurance, which is expensive given the liability exposure. And then legal costs, because lawsuits, from inmates, from families, from advocacy groups, are simply a built-in cost of doing business in this industry. Add it all up, and a mid-sized private facility typically spends somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000 per inmate per year, just to operate. So how does the money come in? This is the part that surprises most people. Private prison operators don't make their money from the inmates directly. They make it from government contracts. Federal agencies like the U.S. Marshal Service and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, along with state departments of corrections, sign contracts that pay the operator a fixed daily rate per inmate housed, commonly called a per diem rate. That rate typically falls somewhere between $60 and $150 per inmate per day, depending on the state, the security level, and the specific contract terms. Do the math on that, and a 1,500-bed facility running near full capacity can generate somewhere between $30 and $80 million a year in contract revenue. And here's the detail that makes this business model genuinely unusual and genuinely controversial. Many of these contracts include what's known as an occupancy guarantee, sometimes informally called a lockup quota. The government agrees to keep the facility filled to a minimum percentage, often 90% or higher, or pay the difference anyway as if those beds were full. From a purely financial standpoint, this is the single most important clause in the entire industry, because it means an empty bed isn't just lost revenue. In many cases, it's revenue. The operator is guaranteed regardless. It completely reframes the incentive structure of the business. A hotel wants guests. A private prison, financially speaking, mainly just wants the beds paid for, whether or not they're empty. Beyond the base per diem, some facilities generate additional revenue streams. Commissary sales, where inmates purchase snacks, hygiene products, and other goods, often at significant markups compared to retail. Phone and video call services, historically priced at rates far above what a normal phone call would cost, though this has faced increasing regulatory pressure in recent years. And in some facilities, inmate labor programs, where companies pay far below minimum wage for work performed inside the facility, though the scale and legality of this varies enormously by state and by whether the facility is public or private. So let's talk about profitability, because when you actually run these numbers side by side, the margins are surprisingly consistent for an industry most people assume is either wildly profitable or barely breaking even. Take that 1,500-bed facility. Say it's bringing in $50 million a year in contract revenue at a reasonably healthy occupancy rate. Operating costs, staffing, food, medical, utilities, maintenance, insurance typically run somewhere around $35 to $40 million a year for a facility that size. That leaves an operating margin in the range of 15 to 25%, which, for context, is actually higher than the margins most hotel chains or hospital systems operate on. It's a genuinely lucrative business if you can win the contracts and keep the beds full. And that's really the entire risk profile of this industry in one sentence. Everything comes down to occupancy and contract renewal. A facility running at 95% capacity under a guaranteed minimum contract is a cash machine. The same facility at 60% capacity, without that occupancy guarantee, can bleed money fast, because your biggest costs, staffing and fixed overhead, don't scale down nearly as quickly as your revenue does when beds sit empty. This is actually why the two dominant players in this space, Core Civic and Geo Group, have spent years diversifying. Beyond just building and running prisons, both companies now operate significant portions of their business around immigration detention, electronic monitoring programs, and re-entry or halfway house services. It's a hedge. Detention policy and sentencing policy shift with every election cycle and every change in federal enforcement priorities, and a company whose entire revenue depends on one type of contract from one type of government agency is exposed to political risk in a way that almost no other industry has to think about. Imagine running a hotel chain where your occupancy rate could be rewritten overnight by a change in federal policy. That's the actual risk private prison operators live with. There's also the reputational and legal side of the ledger, and it belongs in any honest accounting of this business. Private prisons have faced repeated lawsuits and investigations over understaffing, inadequate medical care, and conditions inside facilities, and several state and federal jurisdictions have moved to restrict or phase out private prison contracts entirely in recent years. That's a real cost too, even when it doesn't show up as a clean line item on an earnings report. Contract cancellations, stock price volatility around policy announcements, and the constant possibility of regulatory change are baked into how investors value these companies. So when you zoom out, what you actually have is a business built on three pillars: cheap land in willing rural counties, a workforce paid just enough above minimum wage to keep turnover from getting completely out of control, and government contracts structured so the beds get paid for whether or not they're full. It is, at its core, real estate and labor economics wrapped around a captive population and backstopped by a government client that, in many contracts, can't walk away without still paying the bill. It's one of the strangest business models in America, because unlike almost every other company we've covered on this channel, this one doesn't actually need a great product or a happy customer to succeed. It needs a contract, a full building, and a government that keeps sending people through the door. And whether you think that's a necessary function of a justice system or something that should never have been handed to private companies in the first place, the spreadsheet doesn't care. It just tracks the beds.